My brother-in-law toasted to my failure in front of 12 people at my sister's dinner table, then spent the next 20 minutes explaining to her guests why I'd never amount to anything. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that his entire career, his corner office, his expense account, his identity in this city, all of it existed because I had quietly built the company that gave it to him. And on a Tuesday morning in October, I took it all back. I want to tell you how it actually happened. Not the version my sister eventually pieced together, not the story that circulated through their friends group like a game of telephone. The real version. Mine. I built Northgate Consulting from a studio apartment in Vancouver when I was 26 years old. It started because I watched my father's small landscaping business get swallowed whole by a larger property management firm that had been systematically underbidding him for years. He lost everything he'd spent 18 years building in about 4 months. I was finishing my MBA at UBC at the time, and I made myself a promise standing in his empty equipment shed I would build something that couldn't be taken from me. It took me 3 years to get Northgate off the ground properly, another 2 to make it profitable. By the time I turned 32, we had 46 employees, offices in Vancouver and Calgary, and a client list that included 3 of the top 10 property development firms in British Columbia. I had done it quietly, deliberately, behind what my family still believed was a modest consulting practice that seemed to be doing okay. That was by design. I had watched what happened to successful women in my family's circle. My mother's friend who sold her catering business, suddenly everyone had opinions about how she should spend the money. My cousin who made partner at her law firm, her husband's attitude changed within a month. Like the shift in power was something that needed correcting. I was careful. I kept a separate address for the business. I drove the same Civic I'd had since graduate school. When anyone asked how work was going, I said it was fine. Busy, you know how it is. My sister Renata was 4 years older than me and had married her husband Kevin 6 years prior, when I was still building Northgate through the hungry early years. Kevin worked in commercial real estate, had strong opinions about sports teams and interest rates, and had spent the majority of our relationship as sisters-in-law doing a specific kind of thing that I can only describe as casual diminishment, nothing big enough to cause a scene. Just the accumulated weight of 1,000 small moments. When I was finishing my MBA, oh, you're still studying? At some point, you have to just start living your life. When I launched Northgate, consulting is so saturated right now, I hope you have a backup plan. When I didn't attend a family camping trip because I had a client presentation, see, this is why she'll never be able to have a real relationship. Always working. Renata would laugh uncomfortably and change the subject. I would smile and say nothing. I had learned early that arguing with Kevin was like trying to fill a hole in the ocean. He didn't hear you. He just waited for you to stop so we could continue. The moment that finally made me decide to move up the timeline, I'd always known this was coming eventually. I just hadn't fixed a date. Was a dinner at their house in North Vancouver in early September. Renata had invited her work colleagues and their spouses, 12 people around the table, good wine, cedar-planked salmon, the kind of evening that looked perfect on the outside. Kevin was in a generous mood, which always meant he was performing for an audience. Somewhere between the main course and dessert, the conversation drifted to career changes. One of Renata's colleagues mentioned his sister had recently pivoted from nursing to financial planning. Kevin leaned back in his chair the way he did when he was about to hold court. "That takes guts," he said. "Most people don't have the nerve to admit when something isn't working." He looked directly at me across the table. Some people just keep grinding away at the same thing and wondering why nothing's changing. There was a half-second of awkward silence. Someone reached for their wine glass. "How's the consulting going?" he continued, and the way he said "consulting," with that particular pause before the word, like it needed quotation marks, made the table shift slightly. "It's going well," I said. "Busy for..." "That's good." He smiled at the couple beside him. "She's been at it for years. Very persistent. It's admirable, really." He said admirable the way you'd say it about a child who keeps trying to do a cartwheel even though they clearly can't. I looked at my sister. She was looking at her plate. I had a business development director named Priya, who was one of 3 people at Northgate who knew the full picture of who I was and what the company actually was. That night, driving back across the bridge, I called her. Move up the timeline, I said. I want the restructuring documents ready by the first week of October. She was quiet for a moment. How far up? 3 weeks. I heard her exhale slowly. Okay, I'll make it work. What Kevin did not know, and what I had never told Renata despite several moments of almost telling her, was that Northgate Consulting had acquired the property management firm that Kevin worked for, Pitied Property Group, 14 months earlier. The acquisition had been handled entirely through a numbered holding company, which itself was owned through a series of corporate entities that led back to me. Meridian's existing leadership had been retained on the condition of discretion during the transition period. Kevin's VP of Business Development title, his $340,000 annual compensation package, his car allowance, his corporate Amex card, all of it now flowed from my company. He had been for over a year my employee. He just didn't know it. I want to be honest about something here, because I've read enough of these stories to know where the holes are. The question I knew people would ask is, why wait? Why let it go on? The answer is that the acquisition of Meridian had been complex, and for the first 8 months, I needed Kevin's relationships with his existing clients intact while we completed our due diligence and began the quiet process of restructuring. Disrupting his position prematurely would have cost us 3 major development clients in the Fraser Valley who had personal relationships with him. More than that, and this part I'm less proud of, I needed time to build the case properly. Kevin had a pattern of behavior at Meridian that went well beyond dinner table condescension. There were 2 formal HR complaints that had been settled quietly before the acquisition. There were expense reports that needed forensic review. I wasn't going to act until I could do it completely, which meant doing it right. Priya ran point on the documentation. By the end of September, we had everything. The morning of October 14th, I woke up at 5:30. Kevin would arrive at Meridian's Burnaby office at 8:45, same as always. I got there at 7. Meridian occupied the 4th floor of a low-rise office building near Metrotown. I had never been inside as myself. I'd reviewed the floor plans, of course, sat in on 2 video calls as a silent participant under a different name, but walking through the front door that morning as the actual owner of the company felt like putting on a coat I'd had tailored years ago and never worn. The office manager, a woman named Daphne, who had been with Meridian for 11 years and who I had decided immediately to retain and promote, looked up from her desk. "Can I help you?" "I'm Elise Marchetti," I said. "I'm the principal of Northgate Consulting. I have a meeting with your senior leadership team at 9. She checked her screen. "Of course. Can I get you a coffee?" "Please." "Thank you." I sat in the small reception area and waited. Through the glass partition, I could see the open office beginning to fill. I watched people arrive, log into their computers, refill their water bottles, the ordinary choreography of a Tuesday morning. Somewhere in this building were the files, the emails, the conversations I had read in summary form for months. The reality of a place always has a texture that documents can't capture. Kevin arrived at 8:43. He walked past reception without looking up from his phone. When he reached the hallway and finally glanced toward the waiting area, he stopped. The expression on his face moved through several stages quickly. Confusion first, then something like embarrassment. Then a specific brand of condescension he reserved for situations where he felt he had the social upper hand. "What are you doing here?" He almost laughed. "I have a meeting," I said. "Here? At Meridian?" He looked at Daphne, then back at me. "Are you a client?" "Not exactly." He tilted his head. I had seen him do this with Renata when she said something he found inexplicable. "I don't understand." "You will," I said. "The meeting starts in 15 minutes. You should probably get settled." He stood there for another moment, then walked down the hallway, glancing back once. I heard him say something to his assistant, low enough that I couldn't catch the words. At 9 o'clock, I walked into Meridian's main boardroom. Around the table were the company's 6 senior leaders, Kevin included, along with 2 representatives from Northgate's legal team and Priya, who gave me a small nod as I took my place at the head of the table. There was a moment of profound confusion as the senior team tried to understand why this woman they didn't recognize was sitting where their managing director usually sat. I let it sit for exactly 3 seconds. Then I said, "Good morning. My name is Elise Marchetti. I'm the founder and principal of Northgate Consulting, which completed its acquisition of Meridian Property Group 14 months ago. As of this morning, I'm assuming direct operational oversight of this office. The silence that followed was the kind you can almost see. Kevin's face had gone the color of the whiteboard behind him. He looked at the Northgate lawyers. He looked at Priya. He looked back at me, and I watched the architecture of everything he thought he knew about me begin to dismantle itself in real time. That's not. He stopped. Tried again. You don't. I do, I said simply. Priya distributed the acquisition documentation. I watched Kevin's hands as he turned the pages. His jaw had tightened into a hard line. When he reached the page with the original incorporation documents for the numbered company that held Meridian and traced the ownership chain back to Northgate and from Northgate to my name, he put the papers down flat on the table and stared at them. You've been working here for over a year under Northgate's ownership, I said. During that time, there have been 2 documented HR matters that predate the acquisition, as well as expense irregularities that our finance team has been reviewing. I want to be direct with you all about what this morning means. I looked around the table. For most of you, very little is changing today. There will be a transition process, there will be new reporting structures, and I would like to meet individually with each of you this week to discuss your roles going forward. I paused. Kevin had still not looked up from the documents. For one role, however, there will be a change effective immediately. I looked at him. Kevin, your position as VP of Business Development is being terminated today, for cause. The HR team will meet with you directly following this meeting to complete the process. He looked up then. You can't do this. I can, I said. And I want you to understand that this decision is based on documented conduct. It has nothing to do with our personal relationship. We're family, he said, and the way he said it like it was a card he could play, like it changed the architecture of the situation. Told me everything about how much he still didn't understand what was happening. You're my sister's husband, I said. This is a workplace matter. Those are separate things. He pushed back his chair. One of the Northgate lawyers said, quietly but firmly, Kevin, we'd ask that you remain for the HR process. It's in your best interest. He sat back down. His face had moved past shock into something smaller and more private. Something I recognized as the specific humiliation of a person who has built their identity on being the one who knows more than everyone else in the room. I turned back to the rest of the table. I want to thank you all for your work here. I've reviewed the team's files thoroughly and I'm impressed by what I've seen. I'm looking forward to working with you more closely. I stood. Priya will coordinate individual meetings this week. I'll leave you to get settled. I walked out of the boardroom before Kevin could find any more words. Priya caught up with me in the hallway. HR is with him now. Legal has the documentation. Everything is locked. The Fraser Valley clients? Notified this morning. 2 of the 3 responded already, both positive. Good. My phone buzzed. It was Renata. I let it go to voicemail. I called her back 2 hours later after I'd driven back to the Northgate office in Vancouver and sat in my actual chair for a while. She answered on the second ring. Elise, what happened? Kevin just called me. He's saying things that don't make sense. I know, I said. I'm sorry you're finding out this way. I should have told you before this morning. He says you own his company. I do. I've owned it for over a year. A long silence. Renata, I said carefully. I need you to know that the decision to let him go was not personal. There are HR matters on record at Meridian that go back before I acquired the company. There were expense irregularities. I have documentation for all of it. The termination was warranted on its own terms. She was quiet for a long time. I could hear her breathing. Why didn't you tell me, she finally said, about the company, about any of it? Why did you sit at my dinner table and let him? She stopped. Because I wasn't ready, I said, and because I wanted to handle it properly when I did. Another silence. Then, very quietly, how big is Northgate? 63 employees as of this month. Offices in Vancouver and Calgary. We're opening a 3rd in Toronto in the spring. She made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something else entirely. You drive a 2018 Civic. I like my car. Kevin's severance was calculated according to his employment contract, which required 8 weeks' notice or pay in lieu given his length of service, adjusted for the 4 cause elements that eliminated his bonus entitlement. His company car was collected that afternoon. His corporate card was suspended before he'd made it to the elevator. His non-compete was already active. He would not be working in commercial property management in BC for 2 years. He called me 4 times that week. I let each call go to voicemail. The messages started aggressive, moved into something that tried to sound reasonable, then into something that sounded genuinely confused, like a man who had just discovered the building he'd been living in was made of something other than what he thought. On the 5th day, I called him back. "I have one thing to say to you," I said. "The HR files, the expense documentation, and the recorded conduct from Meridian are all preserved and held by our legal team. If you violate the terms of the severance agreement or the non-compete, those files become relevant. If you don't, they stay where they are. That's your choice." He said nothing for a long moment. "Then, does Renata know everything?" "She knows what she needs to know. She's going to leave me. That's between you and her. It has nothing to do with me. The thing about Renata is that she is far more perceptive than anyone in her circle, including Kevin, had ever given her credit for. She called me 10 days after the Meridian meeting and asked if we could have dinner. Just us. We went to a Vietnamese place in East Vaughan that we'd been going to since we were teenagers, sat in the same booth we always used to argue over, and she said, 'Tell me everything from the beginning.' So I did. She listened the whole way through without interrupting. When I finished, she sat with it for a while, turning her teacup in her hands. 'Were you ever going to tell me?' she asked. 'Before all of this?' 'Yes,' I said. I was getting close. The timing just kept not being right. Because of Kevin? Partly. Because of a lot of things." I looked at her. I watched what happened to Mum's friend when she sold her catering business. I watched what happened to your friend Lisa when she made partner. Success changes the air around a woman in a way it doesn't around a man. I wasn't ready to change the air yet. She nodded slowly. "He did the same thing at home," she said, and the simplicity of it, the way she said it like it was something she'd been carrying quietly, sat between us for a moment. "I know," I said. She filed for divorce 8 weeks later. I didn't suggest it and I didn't discourage it. It was entirely hers. In the months that followed, Meridian was fully integrated into Northgate. The restructuring went smoothly. The senior team, freed from a particular management atmosphere, turned out to be more capable and collaborative than any of the previous performance reviews had suggested. Daphne, the office manager who had given me coffee the morning of the October meeting, was promoted to operations lead. One of the business development associates Kevin had reportedly spent years undercutting. A young woman named Fiona, who had been with Meridian since she was fresh out of Langara, became the top performer in the Vancouver office within 3 months of the transition. I took Renata to dinner the following April to celebrate the Toronto office opening. She had a new apartment in Kitsilano and a stillness about her that I hadn't seen in a long time. She looked like herself again. "I've been thinking," she said, over dessert, "about how long you were sitting on all of this." "I was building something," I said. "You were protecting yourself. Both things can be true." She smiled. "The cartwheel comment," she said, "at the dinner. Do you remember that?" I did. "He went home that night and said you'd seemed unusually confident lately, and he was worried you might be getting your hopes up about the business." She shook her head slowly. "He genuinely had no idea." "No," I said. "He didn't. There's a thing my father said to me once, standing in that empty shed, while I was trying to find something useful to say about what had happened to his business. He stopped me mid-sentence and said, 'Elise, the people who take from you are counting on you not to know your own value. The day you know it, they lose everything.' I don't think he knew, when he said that I was going to spend the next decade building something specific out of that statement. But I did. And in a boardroom in Burnaby on a Tuesday in October, surrounded by documents and witnesses and the particular silence of a man who had just run out of things to say, I understood exactly what he meant. I don't need Kevin to understand what happened. I don't need him to acknowledge anything. He's been interviewing for roles in property management in Alberta, where the non-compete doesn't apply, and from what I hear, it's going slowly. The industry has a long memory. What I need, what I got, was something quieter than revenge and more durable. The knowledge that the thing I had built could not be taken from me, and the moment when the person who had spent years teaching me to doubt it finally had to look at it directly. Northgate's Toronto office opened on time. The spring expansion into the Quebec market is on track. Renata, tame to the ribbon cutting in Toronto, and stood next to me in front of the glass doors while someone took photos, and she squeezed my hand once without saying anything, and I think that was the moment I felt the whole weight of the previous decade lift in a way I hadn't been expecting. I drove home in my 2018 Civic. I still like my car. I still think about the drive home from that dinner in North Vancouver. The salmon had been good, the wine had been expensive, and I had sat at my sister's table while her husband explained to 12 people why I would never quite get there. I drove back over the bridge with the city lights on the water, and I felt something that wasn't anger exactly. It was closer to clarity. The kind that settles in when you've been patient long enough that patience stops being a sacrifice and starts being a strategy. What I've come to understand, looking back at all of it, is that Kevin's behavior was never really about me. People who diminish others are always, underneath it, trying to manage something they feel slipping. He needed me to be smaller because the alternative, that someone sitting quietly at his dinner table had built something he couldn't see and couldn't touch, was genuinely threatening to the story he told about himself. That's a him problem. It always was. But it took me a long time to stop absorbing it as a me problem, and that absorption cost me years of second-guessing my own judgment in rooms where I had every right to trust it. The thing about doing the right thing, slowly, is that it requires a kind of integrity that doesn't get much recognition. I didn't act until I had the full picture. I didn't move against Kevin until I could do it cleanly, documented, with cause, not out of pity or ceremony, but because acting carelessly would have hurt people who had nothing to do with any of it. The Meridian staff deserved a transition that was managed well. The Fraser Valley clients deserved continuity. Fiona, who had been sidelined for years by a manager who found her competence threatening, deserved to be seen clearly before any of the noise started. Doing it right meant doing it slowly. I've made peace with that. What the decade of building Northgate actually taught me has less to do with business than people seem to assume when I tell this story. It taught me that the most important decisions you'll ever make are the ones about what you're willing to understand. I spent years studying how companies failed, how acquisitions went wrong, how leadership cultures poisoned otherwise healthy organizations. That discipline, the commitment to understanding things accurately before acting on them, is what made everything else possible. Not talent, not luck. The willingness to keep learning when it would have been easier to assume I already knew enough. And then there's the question of endurance. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that looks good in a summary. The quiet kind. The kind that looks from the outside like a woman driving a 2018 Civic and saying, "Work is fine, busy, you know how it is." There were years in there that were genuinely hard. Clients who left. A partnership that dissolved badly. 2 quarters where I was not entirely sure the whole thing would hold. Renata once asked me why I never said anything during those periods, and I told her the truth because I didn't want to be talked out of it by someone who didn't understand what I was building. That's not stubbornness. That's knowing the difference between doubt that should stop you and doubt that's just the cost of doing something real. My father lost his business when I was 22. I watched it happen and couldn't do anything about it. What I could do was decide that the same thing would not happen to me, and that the way to prevent it wasn't to build walls, but to build something solid enough that walls weren't necessary. Priya still runs business development. Daphne is now operations lead across 2 offices. Fiona closed the biggest deal in the Vancouver office last quarter. That's the part I think about most.